This is Dwan L. Hearn of the Moon, of course, and I am sitting here with S.A. Bradley. You prefer to go by S.A. Bradley.
Well, first, and then Scott's just fine.
All right, cool. So you're a horror writer, you're a nonfiction writer, you're a podcaster, all in the sphere of horror, naturally. What drew you to horror originally?
I think first I was a scaredy cat. When I was a kid, I was afraid of everything, and I still had this weird draw to horror. What I like to say is that it kind of found me, and it came to me through that fear that I had. I didn't realize that even as a young kid, I felt something akin to trauma, and in that, I found a place that was safe. Weirdly enough, monsters and everything felt much more safe than the abusive people that were in my life, a world that seemed out of control. When I was reading something, I could close the book if I wanted to, or I could watch a movie and I could stop at any time, or I could walk out. And if I didn't do that, I felt at the end there was like some kind of win. So you get kind of this control, albeit very small. And I don't say that I articulated that as a kid, but I realized that I felt better or stronger or like I had a great secret when I was able to endure things that usually people would be scared of. And so I found monsters were kind of my friends. I related to them.
Do you kind of find that in every aspect of your life now that you've grown into an adult and you can articulate it and recognize these things? Do you find that need for control, or at least a more comfort in controlling like situations you have more control of?
Sure. I mean, I don't have a lot of control. I mean, just like any other human being, but I have a much calmer view of it all because something interesting happens that I think happens with a lot of people who get into horror. Not everybody, but a lot of people. They kind of get a great second act. They go through all sorts of hell in their first act in their life. They fall in love with horror, and for some reason, you kind of relax a little bit about stuff. I find that we're I won't say we're better at coping or anything like that, but I would say that we learn to have a sense of humor about ourselves. We also kind of touch on that dark side, and when we touch on that dark side, we say, "Hey, you know what? It's all right." It lets us relax a little bit about ourselves. We have a sense of play in our lives because, if you're looking at Godzilla, I mean, you gotta have a sense of play in that.
Absolutely.
And you get a tribe. You find people who are passionate. And I think you find a passion in your life. You find people who are passionate with you. You've got a friendship that's there. And I don't think a lot of people realize how important the art of conversation is, or the art of being able to create with somebody else.
Yeah.
And so horror, in a weird way, I mean, it could be anything that you are passionate about, but for me, what I like to talk about is how horror is no different. It is not this bastardized art form. It's just like anything else, which means it is just as important and vital as any other art form.
I do happen to see that too. When you say, "Oh, I watch sci-fi," or "Oh, I read fantasy," people are a little bit more broadly accepting of it. But once you start saying, "Oh, I watch horror," they start looking at you
Yeah.
like you're the second coming of the
Right.
devil.
A lot of those people think that there's bad emotions, right?
Right.
Oh, you're stuck wallowing in bad emotions. Like, well, I wouldn't call it wallowing, and I don't think any emotions are bad. I think what you do with the emotions is what's bad. I think we confront these things, and we're unafraid of it. And I mean, even Carl Jung kind of went down that path, right?
Yeah.
We touch our shadows.
Do you feel something maybe like a sense of victory when you go through a horrible situation and you do make it out on the other side?
Oh yeah,
Like in most movies.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. I mean, people always say it's a roller coaster and stuff. They don't never tell you what the roller coaster is, right? It's a catharsis. Well, what's a catharsis for? And it really does reach deep down. I relate with something in the movie. And then I related with Indiana Jones. I related with Luke Skywalker. But I also related with Laurie Strode. And so I get this feeling of victory of like, I made it through this. It never hurt me. Horror movies have never hurt me. The only thing that has ever hurt me is human beings.
That's fair. So that sort of real life catharsis, that sort of sense of true victory, that those positive emotions that you get out of something so broadly viewed as negative, is that what led you to your nonfiction Screaming for Pleasure?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too long because I know we don't got a lot of time. But one of the things
I'll make time. We can go into it.
But one of the things that made me want to write the book was that growing up, I was a nerd. Nerd is a little bit easier now than it used to be.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. So back then, though, it was really like, when are you going to outgrow this, and why are you involved in something that's so grotesque? And that was not only predicated by parents and by politicians, by the church. Entertainment itself was doing that. So I grew up at a time when, like, The Godfather was on TV in the movie theaters, and Jaws was in. So I saw those things out there, and I was literally hearing from critics that movies could change the world. You're going to feel something in your soul. They're telling me that. And then I'd say, yeah, how about this movie about horror? That's a horror movie. And they go, no, not those. And I was like, well, why not? And so my entire life has been kind of this debate. It's been over and over and over about how horror is a prurient thing. It's something to be ashamed of if you're into it a little bit more. It's greasy kid stuff. It's fine if you're a kid, but an adult shouldn't be thinking in these ways. And I was always saying, no, there's art in this. And so the reason that I looked at this book, it's the idea of being happy and healthy, that it's not just going to give you a thrill. It can actually make you feel good as well. And it's not going to, like, cure lumbago or cancer, but it is going to take care of those little things. And the little things mean a lot. And those little things are the emotions that we have that we can't even really articulate. I can't tell you why I feel bad all the time. But I can tell you that sometimes when I watch a movie, I can be affected by that movie, and it can tell me, I connect with you. You're reaching that thing that bothers me. Sometimes it's just making loud noise when you need to. I used to I still do, listen to loud music. And sometimes you just got to scream and jump up and down, and horror allows you to do that in a certain way. So, yeah, the book is kind of about, hey, I had this victory. I feel fucking great. Most of the people that I know that are into this feel really good, and they had maybe not so great of childhoods. They found a way to cope. And so I said, hey, you can find something positive. You cannot have a shadow without light, right?
That's true.
And so there's light right there behind the darkness.
I've always said that, like, you can't appreciate the darkness if you've never experienced the light.
Yeah.
You can't appreciate the light if you've never experienced the darkness.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that just shows you the balance that the universe kind of has to have on us. With all those emotions that we've just shared, that the post positive feelings, this weekend you have shared a story.
Yeah.
Primordial Soup, is that right?
Yes.
And we'll say that has definitely created some emotions, created some feelings. Awe is, I think, the emotion you mentioned earlier.
Right.
What moves you in that direction towards fiction? Of course, the screaming for pleasure is a nonfiction. When it comes to your fiction work, what is that emotion? What drives you down that road for that oh my, or oh my God kind of emotion?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole bunch of things. I think Stephen King said it in Dance Macabre. He goes, if I can, I'll chill you. If I can't do that, I'll terrify you. And if I can't do that, I'll just settle for the gross out. And so there is something to be said about the gross out. But for me, the most delicious, I guess, of all the emotions that you can get is a sense of awe. You talk about that in a biblical term. To look at the burning bush is to put you in awe. And it's terror, essentially, that is so big. I call it horrible beautiful in my nonfiction book. It's something that is so beautiful that you cannot look away, but it is horrible. So it can be maybe an accident. I look at the xenomorph from Alien as horrible beautiful. It's something that's really phallic and nasty and covered with goop, but it's so amazingly beautiful in its otherness that you can't look away. And so I like looking at stories that I try to make stories that'll add that. And I find sometimes to do that is to try and write as beautifully as I can about something that is absolutely grotesque.
And so as I'm listening to Primordial Soup being read both times in the spaces, excellent story, by the way.
Thank you.
I just noticed that there's a comfort sort of in the writing of it. And I almost forgot where I was going with that. But in the grand scheme, it's like, it's beautiful, and that was like a drive. Do you feel like maybe there's something in driving people down different roads to expose them to something, to feel something that they would otherwise be uncomfortable with feeling?
Oh, yeah.
Just to sort of change the space? Or what would be the energy behind that from your end?
Yeah, well, I think that we say that we love horror, and then people who aren't horror fans will say things like, "Well, what are horror movies about? They're just trying to scare you." It's like, no. Rarely do I get scared by horror movies. What I'm looking for is surprise. The thing that I really look for in comedy as well as in horror is you got to surprise me. And I'm either going to gasp or I'm going to laugh, depending upon which level we're hitting at. And so for me, the idea of making people experience something where they're surprised at how they feel about it, I'm always interested in movies that are difficult. Like, I'm not supposed to like that guy, and yet somehow I like him. He's a serial killer. I should not like him. I love when my emotions are played that way, because what I'm forced to do is either be repelled by myself or find empathy and find out why I'm there in that thought. And so when I'm writing, I'm always working on something about myself. You know, I'm not trying to fix somebody else. If they come along for the ride, that's great. But I have things that I'm afraid of, or things that I don't like about myself. And I'll toss those in, or something that I'm not sure what I feel like. How do I feel about sex and violence together? Why is there a moment in that is kind of exciting? You know, what do I say about that? I can't ask my dad. That's not going to work out. So sometimes I go into that and I'm like, I think that most people may not be willing to go down that path, but the people that do really need to. They don't get to all the time.
Modern day horror is kind of does have that newer effect where it's not always about like scaring the audience. There are different emotions that we're drawing through. We get sad, we get happy, we just get enlightened.
Level of dread, constant low level dread.
Do you think that horror is becoming more broad, more inclusive, more to draw in a broader audience?
Oh yeah, well I think it has to in its own way, because communication is so much bigger. So the opportunity to find anything has grown so much from when I was a kid. I had to go to a library, find 5 books, research all the movies that were in those books. But literally, you have all these different venues. So I call horror like it's the Nile. It's the Nile River of genres. All these little tributaries are always coming into it. So we have the opportunity now of getting foreign films. We have the opportunity to have movies that are pure gore and stuff, but we also have movies that are starting to bring in people that there was a monopoly for a while there of white boys. It's that simple. There were white males, were essentially, and teen white males were what people were going for in the 80s. But there were all these people who absolutely love horror and weren't being represented. And now, because the Nile has opened up so much, they're allowed to have that representation whatever way. And sometimes it's nothing more than a filter change. The story isn't even that much different. It's perception, how the story is perceived. So I'm super excited by it, because I think we're talking about all sorts of emotions we didn't talk about before. And we are uncomfortable in those emotions. And that's why people are shouting out about it being woke and shit. They're worried about it. It's nervous. It's a nervous place to be. Well, horror is not supposed to be comfort food. Go have some soup if you want to have comfort. We're supposed to be upsetting the apple cart and making people nervous. So if we have stories about race, we have stories about sexism, we have stories about abuse, we have stories about shame, we have stories about cowardice. All of these things are stuff that we have to work out, I think, on a collective social level. But you reach it by one person at a time, one fan at a time. You don't change society. So horror is always reflecting society, cannot help but do so, because it's an emotional response. Horror is visceral. It's not as intellectual, but it is primal, and it is still art. Art does not have to be intellectual. Art has to have emotion.
I couldn't agree with you more. Speaking of inclusion, and you were kind of almost answering this question on its own, I had noticed over the course of the weekend, the pins, if I want to get a little bit into some of the pins that are on your
I didn't realize
jacket.
that we were doing video. I hope I didn't pick my nose.
No, I don't think so. But a lot of your pins have represented inclusion in all different spaces. What does it mean for you to represent inclusion through representation of the pins on your vest, and how do you feel like horror kind of ties into that same space of inclusion?
Yeah, I think horror is built on the idea of the other. I like to say horror is the second story ever told. The first story ever told around the campfire is the finding out who your family is. It's basically saying, thank you, air and spirits and all of that. And I'm glad we're all here. You're all family. We are strong together with family. But the second story is, don't go in the fucking woods. There's a monster in the woods. Stay with us. Now, whatever the monster is, we don't know exactly, but it is the cautionary tale. Horror is built out of, because we feel the other, we tell the story of the other. And being someone who was an other, I mean, I was a kid that was in a cult, in a Christian cult that said the world was going to end. So nobody wanted to be my friend in elementary school. I was weird because that stuff messed with my head. My family was one of the first to be divorced in that area. So what's wrong with you, kid? What did you do to your family? All of those weird things. By the time I was in high school, I was really separated from everybody. And it got worse as time went on. But I found a way to get out of that. And I can't really articulate why or how. But I think people who don't want inclusion have never been punched in the mouth and fell on their ass and had to explain why they're down there. They've never been on the outs. They've been so scared to be on the outs, they will do whatever is necessary to keep a wall up. If you have ever been on the outs, you find empathy. It's the only way to survive. And so I found empathy because I was an outsider. I'm not everybody's outsider, and I can't say that my situation's the same, but I can let people know I understand. So I don't know if I'm an ally. I let other people tell me I'm an ally. I just try to include and let people know. When I hear that people are being attacked for what they believe and how they look and how they act, and when that thing that they're being attacked with is a belief that isn't about attacking other people, I have empathy. And so I'm like saying, hey, if it's a dangerous world out there, here, I'm proud to say this thing. I would gladly go on a fight against someone who hates other people than someone who is being beaten down. I don't need to be another foot in that kick.
Do you feel like horror as a genre, broad spectrum, has also moved in that direction?
Yeah, I think, I like to say that horror, like I said before, horror moves with the culture. So I also say horror always tells the truth about us. So it was always mirroring the culture. So when we were thoroughly sexist, you can watch The Wolfman and see he's a fucking stalker, Larry Talbot. He's terrible. And we can see how we other the Jews, right?
Right.
That's not being done anymore. It's not horror's job to stay backwards. It goes with whatever is making us nervous. So as we start opening up, horror is going to open up as well. Sometimes that's just with gore. I mean, at a certain point in the 80s, it was about gore. But it was always a retaliation of some sort to some kind of thing that we have anxiety about. So I think that horror is, but it's really the creators and it's the audience. It's going to follow wherever the creators and the audience go. And I think that the creators right now, I'm so happy that there's so many different types, because I've heard the white boy story. I've been the white boy story for a long time. What I need to do is just hear from people who haven't been able to speak. Women in horror have been amazing because they're in the same situation, but they just see it with a different perspective.
Right.
Nothing has to change at all. The scene can stay the same, but the response is different. I'm like, I never thought of that. So if I'm looking for the element of surprise, that's where I find it.
So you also have a podcast.
Yes.
And that is Hellbent for Horror. And that's where you explore horror just sort of across all genres or all mediums?
Yeah, it's funny that you say across all genres, because I talk about non-horror movies with horror movies. Because my thing is, if I say that horror can stand up to the others, I have to be able to compare it to the others. It should be able to stand on its own just as importantly as some other films. So I do that, and sometimes I piss off people going, why are you talking about Rocky? Rocky is not a horror movie. And I'm like, well, I'm talking about the emotion that's done in Rocky. So what I do in that show is it's really a deep dive into all things horror, about television, movies, radio, music, murder ballads, things like that, and how it's always been in our culture, but also how not only that it affects our culture, but the culture affects horror. So I'll do essays, essentially, of like 4 or 5 different movies, but I'll have a theme about them.
Do you feel that the medium, whether it's film, TV, music, etc., do you feel like the medium changes how horror is perceived and like interpreted by the consumer, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess a really good example would be like John Carpenter's The Thing.
Uh-huh.
So John Carpenter's The Thing failed when it first came out in the theaters. It opened in more theaters than E.T. did that year. It was a huge failure. And it's a really small movie if you look at it. If you look at the thing, it's in a couple rooms and it's in a desolate area of Antarctica. There's not a lot to look at. It's white on white on white. And it was in a big cinema, 80-foot screens. It becomes a hit on HBO, a small TV. So suddenly we're watching this movie in a very intimate fashion. We're claustrophobic with it. We're right there. And I think sometimes movies play better in a different medium. I don't think that it matters whether you watch it on, even though I'm a movie guy and I believe the most important thing is to watch it with other people so that it becomes this religious experience for you, or like a tent revival. It can get crazy in a movie when you're surrounded by people who are feeling vulnerable at the same time. But there's nothing wrong with watching it on your phone if you so want to. I think that movies, horror movies especially, seem to always be the vanguards. They're moving forward quicker on incorporating technology into the way that the story is told. We can't assume that the movie structure isn't going to change as technology and the way that we read narrative changes because of what we use and how we use it. The movie Host being done entirely on Zoom. It's done out of necessity, but it also broke down a wall. You know, right there, we're suddenly realizing that there is a story that can literally be on the screen along with the narrative itself, because we've lived with chat windows for at least one generation. So
Yeah.
how can it not be in there, right? So Skinamarink, as perplexing as it can be to someone of my age, I certainly get that maybe being in video games all this time and having the scariest things that we've seen being video games, that the narrative structure is changing. We don't have to have act one, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. That's a little pat. Now we have guy wakes up, we don't know the fucking story. He's in a hallway, he's got to go down, and the hallway just keeps going. And you're either bored because you're waiting for boy meets girl, or you're entranced by going, this feels like my life. I've been in a pandemic for 3 years, and I haven't seen people for 2 of them, and I feel like the walls are changing in my house all the time. That's new horror. And so I think that as technology goes, horror is going to go, and that center of it is always going to be the same, because I think no matter what the technology is, no matter what you're watching it on, whether you're reading it, the emotions are universal. What we're afraid of is still universal. That's never going to change. And it's going to be fearing technology sometimes, but it's always going to be fearing identity being lost, really, by death or by whatever, maiming.
Do you have a favorite medium?
I love movies. I just love movies. I love going to the theater, but with that said, since the pandemic, I've only gone a few times. Not that many people are going to the movies anymore. It doesn't feel as much as a communal thing as it used to, but I'm all about motion pictures. I love them, so I do a lot of physical media. I'm one of those old guys that does a lot of physical media, because there's certain things about movies that I like to cherish.
Well, that's pretty much most of the stuff I wanted to talk about. So, like, just let people know where we can find your works and where we can find your podcast.
Sure. Hellbent for Horror, the podcast, you can find it anywhere that you would normally download any podcast. It's on Apple, it's on iTunes, in other words, Spotify, iHeartRadio, while that's still alive, if it's still alive, and a few others. Wherever it is, I'm pretty much on all of those spreads. You can also find me at hellbentforhorror.com. That goes directly to the podcast, but also is a link to the book. And the book, Screaming for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy, is there. There's also links to interviews that I've done, short story things that I put out, magazine articles, or where you can buy those magazine articles. Just about everything can be found at hellbentforhorror.com. And on the socials, Instagram, Hellbent for Horror, Facebook, Hellbent for Horror, and sadly, Hellbent Horror on Twitter, because Twitter, for some reason, somebody already had it.
Oh, they already had it?
Yeah, weirdly enough. Or was it that you can only have so many letters?
It might be so there's so much space.
Yeah, there's only.
I do have to notice that people on Twitter have to kind of shorten things.
So it was like Hellbent Horror there, and I'm now on Thread for as long as that lasts.
Which might be 5 minutes.
It might be 5 minutes. So.
Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate you sitting down.
It's been a pleasure. It's really been a pleasure.
All right, that's been The Moon.